This is our first subsection, and we'll call this subsection the pump and stator. For now, just set it off to the side, and we will be dismantling our subsections later on. After the pump is separated from the case, you'll notice a 2-tang thrust washer between the reverse input drum and the back side of the stator support. Next, you'll need to remove the 2/4 band from its anchor pin. Working it loose with a screwdriver works just fine. Be careful not to damage the case though. After the band is loose from the anchor pin, you'll now need to remove the input and reverse input drums. Just like the valve body and pump assembly, set them off to the side for now. This is your second and third subsections combined. Next, remove the 2/4 band. Now don't forget the 2/4 band anchor pin. To remove it, simply push it up through the case. Now it's time to rip apart those planetaries. First is your input sun gear. Late model units will have the sun gear mounted to the input sprag. The input sprag is located in the input drum and was removed as an assembly with the input drum. Since this is a subsection, then we will remove the sprag assembly during the teardown of the input drum. The late sun gears are held to the input sprag by these tabs. Next, you will need to remove the output shaft snap ring located here. To do this, you will need to use a pair of snap ring pliers with small angled tips. Here's a pair specially designed just for this purpose. Notice the small tips. Next, remove the top planetary. Once the planetary is removed, you'll notice a Torrington bearing between the top planetary and top ring gear hub. Notice its position and the way it lays on the top planet. Next is the top ring gear and hub assembly. Don't forget the metal 4-tang thrust washer between the sun shell and the ring gear hub. Now late model units will have a Torrington bearing instead of the metal 4-tang thrust washer. The ring gear hub and sun shell were also redesigned. The Torrington bearing snaps on the back of the ring gear hub. Now remove your sun gear shell. After you remove the sun gear shell, you will find a black 4-tang thrust washer. Next, remove the rear sun gear. Now it's time to remove the low and reverse roller clutch, located here. To do this, you will need to remove the snap ring, located here. Notice the position of the anti-clunk spring. This is also where you will find the ends of the snap ring. Using a screwdriver, remove the snap ring. The low and reverse roller clutch assembly is wedged in the transmission case by the anti-clunk spring. The anti-clunk spring is there to keep the low and reverse roller support from rocking back and forth in the case when switching from reverse to drive and drive to reverse. To break the low and reverse roller clutch assembly from the anti-clunk spring, you will need to push it up through the case by using the output shaft. Cushioning the blows, strike the rear of the output shaft. Now you can remove that output shaft. Once the output shaft is removed, you can now remove the low and reverse roller clutch assembly. Notice the direction of rotation of the inner race. The inner race will freewheel one direction and lock the opposite direction. Now push the inner race from the roller clutch assembly. Notice the position of the accordion springs and rollers. To remove the roller clutch element, you will need to remove this snap ring. We will get more into the roller clutch assembly during the inspection process. Next, remove the rear planetary. Between the rear planetary and bottom ring gear hub, you'll find another Torrington bearing, either on the back side of the planetaries or on the bottom ring gear hub. Next, remove the low and reverse clutch pack. Notice the orientation between the clutches and steels. Now remove the cushion plate or wave plate. The purpose of the wave plate is to cushion the apply of the clutch pack. Next, let's remove that bottom ring gear. Now remove the Torrington bearing that rides on the bottom ring gear hub and the transmission case. And lying somewhere in the case is that anti-clunk spring that we talked about earlier. Now let's remove the low and reverse piston and return spring. You do this by removing the snap ring located here. To remove the snap ring, we will need to compress the return spring. To do this, we're going to use the universal spring compressor. Using this tool is really not that hard. Its design and purpose is to compress the return spring, relieving the pressure off of this snap ring. To demonstrate the use of this tool, we're going to use a direct drum from a Turbo 350. First, you will need to remove this snap ring and all of the clutch pack from the drum. Then install the spring arm shoes in the snap ring groove that held the clutch pack in. Compressing the spring arms, install the tool. Then set the pads on top of the return spring cage. Now adjust the pads and lock them in place by tightening the wing nuts. And this is what it should look like. Now you're ready to compress that return spring. Turning the knob clockwise, run the screw down, compressing the spring cage. Now be careful here and don't run the screw down too far. This will distort and damage the return spring cage. Compress it down just enough to give yourself room to release this snap ring. Simple, huh? Now to remove the tool, just reverse the process. Notice how the spring compressor is installed here. The pads are installed on top of the return spring cage, while the spring arm shoes install in the low and reverse roller clutch snap ring groove. Once you have released the snap ring, remove the return spring. Next, let's remove the low and reverse piston. But before you can remove the piston, you will first need to move the parking pawl. The parking pawl is held in the case by a pin and spring, and is held under spring tension by the parking rod and bracket. To move the parking pawl, located here, away from the piston, you must first free the park rod by removing these two bolts located here and here. And then remove the parking rod bracket located here. Once the park rod bracket is removed, the parking pawl will retract inboard enough to remove the piston from the case. Next, you'll need to push air through this hole here to release the piston from the case. Now face the transmission case, bell housing down, and just like we did on the second accumulator piston, using compressed air, move the piston from its bore. Remember, just a little air will do. And there it is, our low and reverse piston. And notice on the piston, the 3 square cut O-rings, here, here, and the third one here. If you need to remove the parking rod and rooster cone assembly, then remove the nut located here. Then remove the manual shaft's retaining clip. Then simply pull the manual shaft from the case. If there's no reason to remove the parking assembly from the transmission case, then to keep the park rod from getting damaged or bent during the cleaning and rebuilding process, install the parking bracket. Using one of the retaining bolts, tighten it down finger tight. Well, how are you doing up to this point? Are you ready to rip apart those subsections? The valve body, and the input drum, the input sprag, and the reverse input drum, and the pump and stator. These are your subsections to the 4L60E. We'll start dismantling our subsections with the pump and stator. To disassemble this subsection, you will need to separate the pump from the stator support. To do this, remove these 5 bolts located here. Then facing the unit with the pump down and bolts facing up, holding the sections together, remove the last bolt. Now remove the stator support from the pump assembly. Let's start by removing the pump body's inner moving parts. But before we remove any of the pieces, let's do a quick rundown of the parts and put a name to them. First is the pump slide. Underneath the slide, you'll find a metal sealing ring and an O-ring seal. And this is the pump slide's inner and outer springs, This is the pump rotor, and inserted in the rotor are the pump vanes. Always make note and count how many vanes are in the rotor. Again, this is where a good camera will come in handy. Next is the pump vane rings. There's two, one on each side of the rotor. And this is the rotor guide, located here. Between the pump body and the slider is the pump slide seal and seal support. And this is the pump slide pivot pin. Now underneath the pivot pin is a tiny spring. During the teardown of the pump, be careful not to lose it. Now that we are a little more familiar with the pump's inner moving parts, let's remove them from the pump body. We'll start by removing the top vane ring, then gently pull the rotor and vanes from the pump. Now pull the vanes from the rotor. Next is that rotor guide. And then the bottom pump vane ring. Now remove the slider and inner and outer springs. To remove the pump slide, using a screwdriver, remove the inner and outer springs. Now you can remove that pump slide from the pump body. Now flip the pump slide over and let's remove the metal sealing ring and the O-ring seal. And there's the pump slide seal and seal support. If you happen to lose them, don't worry, your overhaul kit will come with new ones. Next, remove the pivot pin. Underneath the pivot pin is that tiny spring. Be careful not to lose it. Next, let's remove the front seal. First, remove the seal retainer. Now take extra careful in removing the front seal, not to damage or gouge the seal area. Using a flat edge screwdriver, just like we did on the rear seal, break the seal away from the pump. And remember, don't gouge the pump seal area. If you do, then you've just trashed your pump. If you're not sure about removing the front seal, then take it to a local transmission shop and pay them to do it. It's better to pay them than to buy a new pump. After you're sure you've broke the seal away from the pump seal surface, then pushing the seal from the rear, pop it loose from the pump. This is what you should end up with after the seal is removed from the pump. Notice the smooth seal surface. Now to the stator support. Just like the valve body, the stator houses valves and springs, check balls and orifices. But at this time, we will not get into the main ingredients of the stator support. We'll leave that till the rebuilding process. The only thing you'll need to remove from the stator at this time is the pump screen. Simply remove it from the stator using your needle nose pliers. Don't forget to remove the pump O-ring. During the rebuilding of this subsection, the O-ring will need to be removed for proper indexing between the pump and stator support. The next subsection we will dismantle will be the reverse input drum. But first you'll need to separate it from the input drum. Just simply lift it off. And between the drums, you'll find another Torrington bearing, located here. Notice the way the bearing is positioned in the input drum. Remove the Torrington bearing. Now underneath this Torrington bearing will be the total in-play thrust washer. Notice the identification number on the washer. The numbers range from 67 through 74. The bigger the number, the thicker the washer. To start dismantling the reverse drum, first remove the snap ring, located here. Pop it loose with a small screwdriver or one of your picks. Then remove the reverse clutch pack. Notice the orientation between the steels and friction plates. On top of the clutch pack, you'll find the pressure plate, and on the bottom next to the piston will be the cushion plate. Now take a look at the design of the cushion plate. Unlike the lone reverse cushion plate, where it was waved, the reverse input drum cushion plate is dished, but its purpose remains the same as the lone reverse wave plate was, to cushion the apply of the clutch pack. Next, you'll need to remove the piston, the return spring cage, and the snap ring that holds them in the drum. We'll use the universal spring compressor to compress the return spring, and we'll use it just like we did on the lone reverse return spring cage. Again, notice the way the pads are positioned on top of the return spring cage, and the spring arm shoes and their position in the snap ring groove. Once you have removed the snap ring, then remove the return spring cage, and next remove the piston. Notice on the piston the inner